But I would argue that seeing the threat of climate-induced societal collapse does not obviate the need for a serious conversation about cost. Rather, it heightens the importance. Because if the risk of disaster is truly upon us now, the efforts required to meet that challenge will almost certainly be larger than the efforts we can easily muster. Every dollar must be spent to the best possible effect.
The energy transition, as you all know, is well underway, but a consensus is starting to emerge that this transition, it's a really rocky process, and it's been pretty evident in the last few months why. This is Daniel Westerman. He's the CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator. Quote, coal-fired power is leaving the system faster than renewables are being built to replace it. And if you think about it, big coal-fired plants are scheduled to close in coming years. The last one is scheduled to shut down within the next 10 to 15 years. The Snowy 2.0 hydro scheme is way behind schedule, and so is the massive investment in transmission lines needed to connect the national grid to far-flung solar and wind generation. And then there are the problems associated with battery storage for wind and solar, and that's not to mention the global political climate. We just had elections across the European Union, and I think it's fair to say that the consensus is that these elections represented a widespread populist repudiation of the mainstream parties, and in part this has been driven by a backlash against rising energy costs. This is an editorial from the Australian Financial Review recently. Quote, net zero is at risk of failure. A growing backlash against the rising costs should prompt policymakers to rethink their approach. The Financial Review goes on to say, never has the message to keep all options open seemed more sensible, yet the rapid developments in affordable nuclear power overseas cannot even get a look in. And that's the Australian Financial Review editorial. So the question here this evening is, are we still on the optimal path to net zero? There's a consensus in Canberra that by 2050 we'll reduce our carbon footprint dramatically. And another question tonight will be the issue about carbon-free nuclear energy. Is it really feasible? Should it be part of the mix? It's a big debate right now in Canberra. Well, this evening we'll hear from two speakers, and then afterwards I'll moderate a Q&A with them and you, and I'd encourage you to ask questions to our speakers. First speaker is Alan Finkel. Many of you either know or know of Alan. He was our nation's chief scientist from 2016 to 2020. He's a neuroscientist, engineer, and entrepreneur. He's author of Powering Up. That's a book about the policies and financing of the clean energy transition. He's currently a special advisor to the Australian government on low emissions technologies. Please welcome Alan.
Thank you for that very perceptive overview, Tom, and thank you to you and Aidan for inviting me here today. You touched on some of the important issues, like why is the renewable transition going slower than people had hoped, and that's one of the main things that I want to talk about tonight. I've got a sore throat. Can you hear me at the back? Excellent. It's been many years since I've started a talk by trying to convince the audience that climate change is real. That argument truly was settled several years ago. There might be some holdouts. Some of the holdouts might be here tonight, but it hasn't been something that I've been talking about. But I do want to talk about climate change just very briefly because something has changed. So as an engineer, I always approach things with the engineering method, which starts by defining the problem, then analysing the problem. And it sounds really trite, but a lot of people don't define the problem. They just jump into the solutions. So what is the problem? The problem is not that climate change is real. The problem is that climate change is happening faster than had been anticipated. You've probably been seeing headlines, but let me bring it home to you. You've heard that phrase, keep 1.5 alive. That's the Paris primary goal, 1.5 degrees rise above the pre-industrial baseline, which was 1850 to 1900. Well, if you look at the global average temperature for the last 12 months that finished 2 weeks ago, so from the beginning of June last year to the end of May, just a few weeks ago, every single month in that 12-month period was a record hot month compared to the corresponding months in previous years. And the average for the 12 months was 1.63 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline. It has surprised everybody. Now, it could be a blip. It might go down again next year, but it's an extraordinary blip if it's just a blip. It's an extraordinary rise if it's going to be continued. So there is we're not in a comfortable place is what I'm saying. There is some urgency to do something. Now, what creates that temperature rise, you know exactly what it is. It's the atmospheric concentrations. And this is another thing that I'll just quickly mention to you. If you look at the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide for the last 50 years, either measured at Cape Grim, which is the northwest cliff face in Tasmania, or on the mountains in Hawaii, so northern hemisphere, what you see is a curve that's going like that at first glance, but if you look carefully, it's actually bending up. So it didn't slow down with Kyoto in 1997. It didn't slow down with the Paris Accord or Paris Agreement in 2015. In fact, it's been slightly accelerating. And last year, the parts per million count of the concentration of carbon dioxide went up by a greater increment than it's ever gone up in any year in recorded history. So the problem is real, and what we've been doing so far has been manifestly insufficient. Now, the greenhouse gases, 73% of the greenhouse gases are the carbon dioxide that comes from using fossil fuels, primarily burning the fossil fuels for energy, but also we use coal, oil and gas as chemicals in industry. Whether you're using it, burning it to generate energy, or you're using the fossil fuels as a chemical, you are going to generate carbon dioxide. So we have to replace the fossil fuel use for direct use in energy or for as a fuel. So we need to replace fossil fuel energy with zero emissions electricity. I'm switching from the word energy to electricity because I'm being very specific. We're not talking about renewable energy. We're talking about renewable electricity that you can use in the economy. And where you need the chemicals, you can use even more electricity to split water to get hydrogen, then even more electricity to combine the hydrogen with carbon and oxygen and nitrogen to make the chemicals that you need for industrial processes. So it all comes back to having vast quantities of zero emissions electricity available to us. Now, what are the options? There are probably 10 different ways you can get zero emissions electricity, but only 4 scale up. So when people talk about some of them, like tidal and wave and geothermal, or solar thermal, or biomass to electricity, they just don't scale to the level that we need. The 4 that do scale are solar photovoltaic, wind, hydroelectric power, and nuclear power. And they are the only 4. And I have to step back to hydroelectric power and just distinguish. Tom, you rightly mentioned Snowy 2.0. Snowy 2.0 is not hydroelectric power. It's an energy storage system. You generate solar and wind electricity to pump water up the hill into an upper dam, and then when you want electricity back, you let it flow down and run a generator. That's not hydroelectric power. That's just storage. Hydroelectric power is like Lake Yukonbean, where you have a catchment area of 500 square kilometres. The rain comes down into a river, into a giant reservoir, and that can run for months at a time. So there's only 4, solar, wind, hydroelectric and nuclear. Now, Australia has said no to hydroelectric power, not vocally, through silence. We have not commissioned a hydroelectric power plant since 1984. 40 years ago, the Wivenhoe Dam just outside of Brisbane was the last, even including Tasmania, it was the last large-scale hydroelectric dam in Australia. And no one is talking about hydroelectric power in Australia, so that's out. The fourth one is nuclear, and the Howard government legislated a ban and a deal with the Greens in 1998 against the consideration of nuclear for power in this country. So of the four that remains, we've said no to two of them. Now, if you stop for the moment and put your engineering hats on, let's talk about the attributes. Let's talk about the attributes of these four energy sources. Are they all zero emissions? Absolutely. Absolutely zero emissions. And frankly, if you look at the lifetime emissions from manufacturing the plant, nuclear electricity is about a quarter of solar electricity. But just on the daily running emissions, it's zero in all cases. Another very important attribute of a generation is whether it's synchronous. We have what's called an AC electricity system. It's alternating current. The voltage and the current go up and down 50 times a second. Solar and wind don't know about that. They don't contribute to maintaining the frequency, so you have to use a lot of electronics to interface them. Whereas hydroelectric power and nuclear power are absolutely intrinsically synchronous generators that switch into the heartbeat of the AC system and actually strengthen it. Another important characteristic for generation is it dispatchable? Solar and wind are not dispatchable. You can't get them to generate when you want them. You hear about it all the time. People say, oh, they don't work when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. Of course they don't. They're not dispatchable. But hydroelectric power and nuclear power will generate electricity exactly when you want it, and it'll switch off when you tell it to switch off. And they'll do it for months. You can get a hydroelectric power plant in Tasmania or the Snowy Mountains original scheme, and they'll generate electricity for months if you need it. Nuclear is an incredible standout because nuclear won't generate just for months. Nuclear will generate 365 days a year. The only reason, if you actually want nuclear to dispatch, the only reason it won't dispatch is when it's down for maintenance. So nuclear is the most extraordinary of the all. And the last characteristic that's important is the resource footprint, the mining that you have to do to build solar plants and the battery backups and the wind turbines and transmission lines. It's a very high ongoing resource requirement for solar and wind, a modest resource requirement for hydroelectricity, and a very small resource requirement for nuclear. Now, when we talk about nuclear, and Aidan will probably talk about these things a lot, there are two types. People talk about the small modular reactors and the large-scale reactors. Small modular, by definition, is up to 300 megawatts. Large is typically a gigawatt or more. I personally feel that we should be doing nuclear eventually, and maybe one day we'll be doing small modular reactors, but we can't plan for them at the moment because there are only two in existence in the world. One's in China, and it was built as a demonstrator, but with no intention of it being the first of a series. So there's nothing happening in China on small modular reactors yet. And the second one in the world is in Russia. It's an ex-military ship reactor that uses bomb-grade uranium. It's so scary that even the Russians, connected to a town called Pevek, which is the northeast of Siberia, as far away from Moscow as you can imagine. So small modular reactors will happen, but there are none in use in any OECD country, none in construction, none in use, not even any that have gone through the regulatory process. But with large reactors, they're here and now. And if Australia was to make the decision, it could start the planning process immediately with large reactors. And I'm sure that Aidan will talk to that. Now, looking at the solar and wind generation in Australia, the deployment is flat. If you look just at solar and wind, forget hydroelectricity, because that's never going to change. The increase in the annual increase on average in the 3 years, 2019, 2020 and 2021, so it's the previous government, the average increase was 3.9 percentage points. In other words, if it was 20% one year, it was 23.9% the next year. And in the following 2 years, 2022 and 2023, it's hardly changed. It's down from 3.9 to 3.8. It's almost indistinguishable. But the anticipated and hoped for increase in rate of deployment and generation has not been happening. So you've got to say why. Why is it so flat, even though we have ambition on our side? We've got governments at the federal level and the state level who set targets. We've got the AEMO integrated system plan to help define the way forward. A lot of the governments, particularly the New South Wales government and Victoria and others, have roadmaps of how they're going to get there. And there's tons of financing, there's tons of private sector financing lined up. There's tons of federal government and state government support financing lined up. And you've got developers falling over themselves with their eagerness to build solar and wind. So the slowdown or the flat deployment is not because we don't have ambition. We do. And it's slow even though we have technology on our side. Of course, we want to keep investing in research and development because we want to make the batteries cheaper, we want to make the solar panels cheaper. But if you stopped all the R&D, we've got the technology we need to get to a 100% solar and wind supported by batteries. I'm not saying anything about the cost, but we've got the technology to get there. And we've got control software for the system, all sorts of things. I wrote a book called Getting to Zero, just about the technology to show that we've got the technology to get there. But despite that, things are flat. So despite the ambition, despite the technology, things are flat. Then the third big issue that has to be resolved is supply chains. And you mentioned I wrote a book called Powering Up, which is about the supply chain issues. You know, the mining, the ESG investing, the carbon tax policies, government incentives, all those sorts of things. And it's difficult. The supply chain is difficult, but it always works itself out. And especially things like the cost of lithium and nickel. I was chairing a conference last year called the Sydney Energy Forum. We had Hugh Mackay, the chief economist from BHP there. And he said a very pithy quote, which I'm sure some of the economists in the room would know. The cure to high prices is high prices. The supply chain will work itself out. So despite all of that, deployment is slow, and it sort of gives me nightmares at night, or at least makes me concerned. The remarkable thing is that the approvals of large-scale solar and wind projects has plummeted. So in 2017 and 2018, over 60 projects in each year were being approved across the country. But in 2022 and 2023, it was 11 and 12 approvals in each of those years. It's a stunning reduction. And the time taken for those approvals is extraordinary. In New South Wales, it's been between 5 and 8 years. In Victoria, it's faster. It's between 3 to 5 years, and Queensland and South Australia are faster again. But the approvals process is so slow that it's an impediment to deployment of new resources. So basically, there are barriers in place. There's another category of barriers called the social licence barriers, landowner resistance, traditional owners and the heritage requirements, and what I'll call local environmental myopia, people worrying about the local biodiversity and absolutely ignoring planetary biodiversity benefits that will be gained by building a wind farm. So you see wind farms being blocked to prevent not destruction of, but risk to a couple of birds, whereas because of global warming, we had bushfires in 2019 where 3 billion birds, possums, snakes, marsupials and reptiles died. But the regulations don't look at that planetary, and if we build a wind farm, you reduce that risk, but the regulations don't look at that. So that's what I call local environmental myopia. And then, of course, we've got the government systemic boundaries. I already mentioned the slow and ponderous approvals. There's not enough central planning. We've got a free market system, which is fine. I applaud that. But it's too complex to be just led to the free market. And it's too important to not have some central guidance. Electricity is not like food or avocado. I always compare electrons to avocados. You know, if avocados are expensive, people just stop buying avocados. But if electrons are expensive, people still have to buy them. It's an essential service, millisecond by millisecond. And then the markets are complex. Because of the variability in all these other things, the national electricity rules have had 200 rule changes since 2005 and have grown to 1,750 pages. It's probably worse than the tax code. And so where we've ended up is a win-lose imbalance where local biodiversity is the winner, but global biodiversity and economic benefit is the loser. So you've got to ask the question, how do we end up with these win-lose outcomes? Well, it's because of a misunderstanding of the purpose of regulations. The purpose of good regulations is to do two things: to protect, if it's a medical device, to protect your health; if it's a environmental issue, to protect the local environment. So the first purpose is to protect and facilitate economic outcomes, facilitate planetary biodiversity benefits. Good regulations should protect and facilitate. But what's happened, the wrong conjunction is being used, and they're being interpreted as protect or facilitate. We should be capable of doing both. And when they're looking at protect or facilitate, the regulators tend to come down on protect, and facilitation loses out. And the scales are therefore incredibly lopsided from where they should be. So is there a role for government to help to accelerate this rollout of renewables? Well, the trouble is that regulations accumulate and become barriers to progress, and little tweaking around the edges doesn't solve the problems. Approvals have to be faster. There have been some attempts at federal levels, but they've often been walked back. There have been some attempts at state levels. Victoria's brought in some new regulations that restrict the rights of non-involved people to protest against a ruling to approve. But overall, you'd have to say it's been very little progress because it's politically difficult. We also need a deeper understanding of community concerns expressed by farmers and landowners, by traditional owners and by environmentalists. I think governments and industry have to turn not to the technologists at universities, but to the social scientists. We really have to deeply understand what's going on. And even though I'm not talking as a proponent of nuclear, I do support nuclear as a clean energy solution, perhaps 20 years on or 15 years on, that will be useful for centuries to come. But nuclear power, the deployment of nuclear power will face the same regulatory approval process problems, and it will face the same social license problems. And even if 70% of people approve, the 30% who don't approve will be vocal about it. So we have to deeply address these systemic bureaucratic barriers and the social license barriers. Another way forward is to engineer detours around the barriers. And to some extent that can be done. One is to capitalise on rooftop solar, which has been going gangbusters in Australia because you don't need regulatory approval. You just sign the contract and 3 weeks later it's done. Aidan will talk about the cost of it. But doing it is easy. And if you can get people to put in batteries and then have a collaborative system where they're all working to, not because they're thinking about it, but through software, collaborate and contribute to the smooth generation of electricity, that's an engineering solution to part of the transition needs. Another one is to take our existing transmission lines and instead of building new ones, see if we can eke more capacity out of them. And that can be done with management software, but also a new family of conductors that has been developed that replaces the traditional spiral wound aluminium conductors with carbon composite cores and specialised aluminium alloys around there, and they can carry between 60% and 100% more current if you use them to replace the cables on existing transmission lines. And there's dynamic line rating software that makes the utilisation of the transmission lines better as well. So there are some engineering solutions, but they're not enough to overcome all the issues. So what is the way forward? Aidan, I'm sure you'll present some recommendations. My main point is that technology has now become secondary to the social license and systemic barriers. My personal considerations and concerns have migrated from technology when I wrote a book about technology, migrated from supply chains to the only thing I worry about now are the social license and systemic barriers. We need social scientists to elucidate the barriers. We need governments to lower the barriers. We need engineers to find detours around the barriers. And all of that has to be addressed, not just for solar and wind, but for nuclear to be successful too. May the force be with you. Thank you.
Alan, thank you. And now to our next speaker, Aidan Morrison. He is the head of our energy program at the Centre for Independent Studies. He's only been with us for a few months, but already he has played an important role in co-authoring some of our papers already published. One is the impact of a shadow carbon price on our electricity bills. And the other one, which attracted quite a bit of media publicity, was the 6 fundamental flaws underpinning the energy transition. Please welcome Aidan.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you, Alan, for a brilliant opening address. Tonight, I'm arguing that we must rethink the energy transition. We have to rethink after we have an important, open, honest conversation. It's the conversation about cost. I'm going to tell you tonight why I think that conversation is so important, just how we've managed to get to where we are without having it yet, and once we've had it, where I think our course might divert from the one we're currently on. But first, I want to respond to a comment that I often get on social media about why not to have the conversation. Whenever myself or part of our team raise a cost that hasn't been considered or exposed adequately, a frequent response is to say something along the lines of, but compared to the cost of doing nothing with climate change, this cost is trivial, so we should plough ahead and do it anyway. And this points to a core question, which is a tricky one. How do we balance the costs and risks of climate change emerging in the future with the costs borne today to avoid it? I'd like to take the objection seriously. It's a good one. But I think there's 2 real reasons why this argument, which can easily excuse spending any cost, is actually misplaced. The first is that climate change, whilst a problem, it still isn't the only problem in the world. There are other challenges and other opportunities that our dollars demand. And the second is that climate change still might be a very big problem, big enough that we'll always find ourselves wishing for more dollars than we're likely to easily muster to solve it. And because of that, we cannot afford to waste a single dollar. It's my contention that if we don't measure it, we won't manage it either. And this leads to us wasting the opportunity to address it properly. Let's spend just a moment on the science, which I think Alan has covered quite well. I'll tell you briefly what I think is very clear, and then what I think is less clear, and why that's led to such a fraught debate in Australia. There is certainly a very clear mechanism by which CO2 in the atmosphere contributes to the warmer planet, and there's a very obvious mechanism by which humans have put a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. It's burning of fossil fuels. I don't think that I'm one that would dispute that we are affecting the climate. The more difficult question is a question about just how bad that effect gets for us here on Earth, and then the consequence of what do we spend now? How much and how fast can we spend now to avert those future risks? These are quantitative questions that have inherent uncertainty, and it's extremely difficult to get confident answers on them. I think it's a sensitive topic. Opinions vary widely and tend to polarize. There are voices that decry any variance, claiming that any hesitation about spending any cost amounts to climate denialism. I'm not one of those. I know enough about science to know that when it's done well, there is often some uncertainty, and it has to be acknowledged. In the case of the climate, there's a little bit of uncertainty about just how fast the carbon affects the temperature, but there's a little bit more uncertainty about how much the temperature reflects in particular places on the Earth and how easy it is for things to grow and thrive, including humans. It's a big, complex system. Massive ocean currents, air currents, feedback loops, both positive and negative, affecting different places differently. But this uncertainty takes us to a deeply uncomfortable place, assessing what are inherently risks, probabilities. Uncertainty is also not a good reason to do nothing, but it sure does complicate things. Hesitation and division are dangerous things to have in a tribe. And tribal animals, I think ultimately humans are. We seek an action plan that is clearly still the right thing to do, despite the uncertainty we have around us. And that's why I think significant institutions, personalities, including the media, tend to oversample from the extremes of the probability distribution. Essentially, it's a strategy to create certainty of action when there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. It's basically attempting to claim there's less uncertainty and more certainty. Some suggest there's no link at all between carbon and the climate, or even that the evidence has been falsified. They're advocating for no action at all. Others suggest that unless emissions are eliminated almost immediately, literally in 5 or 15 years, then we face almost certain imminent ecological collapse and societal collapse following after that. I think most people, myself included, recognise these are extremes and fall somewhere in the middle. But that leaves us in this awkward place, addressing uncertainty, evaluating future risks, and trying to find a course of action that we can build consensus around. Just how do we go about doing that? I don't think it's personally worthwhile just shouting at those that have a different view, wishing that their perceptions of future costs and risks, and current ones, are closer to our own. There will always be people for whom the risk of climate change looms less large, and it might not be because they don't think the risk is real, but it could be they perceive the risk of disasters to be lower or more distant, or it might be simply that they have other struggles in their life that they're facing right now that takes precedence in their attention. These are real people, real positions, and their opinions deserve respect. Raising a family, keeping a job, paying a mortgage are things that people worry about, and that's not about to change anytime soon. But we also have clearly many people for whom the risk of climate change looms very large and near and demands urgent action, even at significant cost. But I would argue that seeing the threat of climate-induced societal collapse does not obviate the need for a serious conversation about cost. Rather, it heightens the importance. Because if the risk of disaster is truly upon us now, the efforts required to meet that challenge will almost certainly be larger than the efforts we can easily muster. Every dollar must be spent to the best possible effect. So being deeply engaged, open and honest about the costs should be a requisite step in debate for both ends of the spectrum. This is now what's happening, I think, in the case of trying to win over social license. It's been a big theme at Energy Week here in Melbourne this time. It's expected that developers and proponents of change, new transmission, etc., sit around the kitchen table, acknowledge the fears, acknowledge the costs that imposing a new piece of infrastructure on others will bear. It has to be taken seriously. But by showing that you take the costs seriously and you've done every measure to minimise them in pursuit of societal benefit, that's the way you win trust and get the social licence to proceed. It's my argument we need to do the same thing with earning the economic licence. But sadly, I think the trust has been broken. Instead of honest acknowledgements of the costs, I think a childish game that equates cost with investment and makes the whole pursuit of climate action as some sort of cost-relieving exercise is well underway. The costs have simply been hidden. Do you think in the massive effort that's been involved to create something like the Integrated System Plan, the thousands of pages, the tens of thousands of man-hours and compute hours, we couldn't build up a simple picture of the bill that will hit households if we build this system in the future? I've been walking around for days amongst energy modelers. We know it's possible. Some people have done it. But instead of putting it front and centre at the top of the Integrated System Plan, this has not been the sort of thing that's been released. In a recent report we published, which Tom mentioned, the 6 fundamental flaws, we've been basically arguing that CSIRO's Gen Cost and the AEMO's, the Australian Energy Market Operators Integrated System Plan, it's our contention that rather than supporting an honest and sometimes confronting conversation about the costs, these 2 documents have been used to build what I would call an undeserved aura of economic superiority surrounding renewables. When you boil it down, they make 2 specific claims. First, that a renewable energy dominant system is the lowest cost system. That's supported by CSIRO's Gen Cost. And the second, that we are currently building the lowest cost version of that renewable energy system. Both those claims, I think, on close inspection, don't stack up. And I think the aura of economic superiority that surrounds renewables today is ultimately undeserved. Let me tell you a couple of hard truths. These will be confronting, maybe spur some disagreement, but I seriously think they are true. The lowest cost contribution to a reliable energy system is coal. It always was. We haven't forgotten how to dig it up. We are nowhere near running out of it. It's still the cheapest today. It will be cheap in 5 years or 50 and probably 100 or 200. For all its flaws, and there are serious ones, it's a massive contributor to emissions. There's no denying that it's cheap. The highest cost contribution to a reliable energy system, drum roll please, in my opinion, it is rooftop solar. Solar of any kind contributes very little to a reliable energy system without massive storage to back it up. But the one way to make it a truly ineffective and very costly investment is to take a large industrial solar farm, shatter it into a few thousand tiny little pieces, scatter it over a bunch of different rooftops, remove all the single access tracking, never wash the panels themselves, give ownership to thousands of individual owners who are not able or interested to follow anything about what the rest of the grid requires, then bid and entice them to give control back to an organisation that via a remote computer can see what's happening in the rest of the grid and try to make that all work. And by the way, a battery that costs 5 times as much also has to be thrown in the mix somewhere as well. The fact is, for the whole system, the whole reliable system, rooftop solar is not the best. And yet, these two contentions are the exact opposite of what the documents and institutions would have you believe. I think we have a dire risk of basically fitting the economic analysis to match our social perceptions. Coal is in the sin bin, rooftop solar sporting a halo. And I think honest, objective analysis has been the loser. So how do we get to this position? Well, it's quite clear, in my opinion, if you read the fine print on CSIRO's Gen Cost. This is the key document that claims that renewables are cheaper than coal. It's all in the fine print. The key words: it has to be new coal. It has to be greenfield. There is provision for new connections to an exports-exposed coal mine. There's no consideration of refurbishments, no considerations of extension to brownfield sites adjacent to existing one, no consideration of standard subcritical coal power stations, which we have many of, no consideration of the supercritical coal power stations, such as our latest plant at Cogan Creek. There's no consideration of ultra-supercritical, which is the state-of-the-art that's being built around the world. There is only consideration of a single, isolated, 700 megawatt, greenfield, advanced ultra-supercritical coal-fired power station. A design which, by the admission of Oricon that commissioned the research for this, admits has never been built anywhere in the world. This thing operates at temperatures and pressures that would make a pressurized water nuclear reactor look like a warm bath. And finally, the coal price is taken from the peak of the energy crisis that was induced by the Ukraine war. The highest of the high prices recorded as the high ones, and the lowest isn't the lowest, it's actually the average, skewed up, of course, by the Ukraine war. So I would say this simply isn't a picture that accurately reflects the reality of what coal has provided to our system and would provide to our system if we asked it to. And the layering of political judgment onto the economic costings is on naked display in the report. In responses to some submissions, including, I think, the one that Centre for Independent Studies wrote, CSIRO put, some stakeholders take a view that although Australia has bipartisan commitment for net zero emissions by 2050, the highest greenhouse gas emitting options should remain on the table. The deployment of new coal has low plausibility given its high emissions. A high efficiency design brings it closer to being plausible. Now, I don't necessarily want to advocate for expanding coal-fired power stations. I just want Gen Cost to be the product that it says it is on the label. And if you read the website, it says that it is accurate, policy and technology neutral cost estimates. This logic they've outlined that points to politics, to point to plausibility, to justify taking a biased view in their technology and plant selection is the opposite of that. Now, why does this matter if we don't actually want to expand new coal? Well, I think it matters because truth matters, and our understanding of the truth matters. The lived experience in Australia of many Australians my age and older is that Australia has had for a long time very low-cost, reliable electricity. And the low-cost part, at least, is starting to change. And there's two possibilities for how that's happening. Either coal has suddenly become more expensive under our feet as we use it, and we haven't been able to add enough wind and solar to get us off the now expensive coal that we've been using for so long, or the addition of weather-dependent reliable energy to the system has introduced more costs than it's been able to relieve. I'll let you figure out which one of those two it almost certainly is. What about rooftop solar? How do we come to believe that this is the best value contribution to our energy system? Well, I think most people learn reality through the hip pocket nerve. And we've given subsidies and distortive tariff structures that have created the impression that rooftop solar saves households a lot of money. The reality is that it saves the overall energy system frightfully little, mostly just the saving of fuel. But the rest of the system to back up the solar when the sun doesn't shine has to remain in place, and the costs remain in place too. So the illusion of saving money comes from a mix of shifting costs from one consumer's bill to another, or also allowing consumers to consume less electricity but pay more for the remaining kilowatt hours they consume. Load-shaped premium is the technical word given to this effect. Now, I think the introduction of export tariffs, whereby solar owners get charged for sending their excess power to the grid, which has just been announced to great consternation in the last few weeks, I think this is one of many bitter truth bills that Australians are going to be asked to swallow. The costs simply can't be hidden forever, and they're starting to be revealed. But what about for those boffins listening? How do sophisticated models, like the Australian Energy Market Operator's Integrated System Plan, how do those very sophisticated models manage to miss the problems and costs associated with rooftop solar as well? It's quite simple. They just don't include any of those costs in their modelling. Ponder that. Consumer energy resources, that's rooftop solar, home batteries, electric vehicles, a model in the ISP is producing an awful lot of electricity. In fact, as the CEO of AEMO, Daniel Westerman, said just a few metres away from here a day or two ago, these consumer energy resources will be an indispensable part of the future energy system. He's right. Rooftop solar will be the largest single generation asset by installed capacity. Home batteries, the largest single storage asset by capacity as well. And remember, the distribution network, which connects all those together, is the largest single network asset by cost in our bills today. All of this is modelled to exist. The electrons flow in the models. It's just not modelled as a cost. There's no dollar figure in those models associated with those capacities. I think this is a fundamental flaw indeed. I don't think a reasonable person, when optimising the overall system cost to consumers, can claim their optimisation is robust and rigorous if they exclude all of the largest costs, particularly if their basis for doing so is simply that the costs are borne directly by consumers. In reality, costs just don't disappear. They only disappear from the documents. For a while, they disappear from the discussion. There are other fundamental flaws. The carbon is left out of our modelling too. The largest contribution to the renewable energy carbon footprint, of course, is the embodied carbon. All the steel, all the silicon, all the lithium that has to be mined and refined. It's simply not included in the integrated system plan at all. Scope 3 versus Scope 1 is their justification for doing that. Ardent advocates for high levels of action on climate change should be deeply concerned about that as well. But also, these documents obscure the fact that the assumption of perfect foresight of the weather is baked into the code, quite literally into the nature of the linear programs that are used to produce these models and forecast. They're inherently susceptible to being overfit. What we get is a kind of shrink wrapping of the installation of energy resources that fits exactly the weather patterns that are fed into the models and assumed in the future. And we can see instances where the model will quickly build 4 gigawatts of gas in just the year before there's a shortfall in solar output, probably due to a La Nina. In reality, we're going to need to be ready for any weather year absolutely every year. And the system that's ready for that will cost an awful lot more. In particular, we'll need a lot more gas capacity constantly available. The models can't currently value the certainty of the availability of gas backup because they don't know what uncertainty is. They know all the weather with certainty in advance. And this has a profound impact on one key element of the transition that is causing enormous social strife and hasn't had the economic scrutiny that I think it deserves. That's transmission. There's no transition without transmission. Simple catchphrase, used by many, including our energy minister. But not all transmission is actually good value. Some is required to physically connect a generator to reload, but the volume that's being asked for in the integrated system plan is for a very different purpose: to provide massive interconnection capacity between different regions, different states, to provide insurance value to one region when the weather is poor, hoping that it's better in another region. That's the transmission that's being advanced with all haste in projects such as VNI West and HumeLink in particular. And it's these projects, to have any benefit in the cost-benefit analysis, rely on saving a bit of that extra gas capacity. That's the bit of extra gas capacity that I'm sure we inevitably need to install anyway to deal with the problem of perfect foresight. In other words, I think the interconnectors are a waste. They're massively antagonising regional communities, and they won't actually serve any serious economic purpose. And there's yet another problem with the cost-benefit analysis of transmission. Interconnectors like VNI West and HumeLink, they depend on massive sunk costs being excluded from the cost-benefit analyses. In particular, Snowy 2.0. Yes, we've started building it. We've spent maybe $5 billion, but there's another $7 billion or more to come. That money is not yet spent. Future costs shouldn't be treated as sunk. Otherwise, we are really embarking on the worst form of a sunk cost fallacy. This, in essence, is, I think, where the current plan has gone badly wrong, including in the integrated system plan. It was envisioned as a coordinating document, enabling just the best and most efficient resources to be incorporated, balanced and optimized from different states and regions. This is the vision that Dr. Finkel outlined in his important paper. It's a logical and defensible proposition in developing the least cost version of a low carbon system. But what's happening now in the ISP, in my view, is almost the opposite. Instead of demanding that the whole system incorporate just the best, most efficient projects selected across all the states, now the integrated system plan essentially pours concrete around the projects that are subject to almost no comprehensive whole-of-system economic analysis. They're simply declared to be required by state governments or the federal government, and the ISP inserts them in their base case scenarios. The height of irony, I think, is reached in the Queensland State Government's Energy and Jobs Plan, in the economic modelling commissioned from Ernst & Young to justify the Energy and Jobs Plan. The scenario, which is based on the integrated system plan, which should be our coordinating document, is labelled uncoordinated approach. It's the alternative that includes all the other massive investments that's being advocated for. Things like the Barumba Pumped Hydro project, which will cost maybe $14 billion, Copper String, $6 billion, and others. Quite simply, I think the claim that we are currently building the least cost version of a renewable energy system lies in tatters when we subject it to close scrutiny. And the claim that a weather-dependent system is the least cost of all options has, in my opinion, never been credibly supported in fact. It's my contention that weather-dependent systems just don't scale well. A little bit is easy while you've got the rest of the system still there to back it up. But we're in the fork of the road right now trying to get that weather-based system to replace the thermal generators that we've previously had. And from about here on, every new bit of weather-dependent energy will have to be moved further around the country or around the clock or around the calendar to make it useful and contribute to decarbonisation. And that moving energy around is expensive. In short, the honeymoon for renewables is over. That's why I think we need to rethink this energy transition. Once we've had an honest conversation about the costs of renewables, we'll realise that we can't afford to exhaust ourselves just on this step of decarbonising electricity. arguably, we shouldn't have to break a sweat on electricity because decarbonising the other 75% of our emissions, things like steel, cement, aviation, international shipping, fertilisers, will probably be harder than the electricity step. I think that nuclear is the key to making the electricity step scalable. It's the opposite of renewables. It's quite hard to get started, but it scales up beautifully in the system, and it lasts a very long time. Once you pay off the initial investment, it will become a cheap source of electricity, possibly even competitive with coal. It's my view that things that cost a little bit more now but provide a clear path to scalable, sustainable electricity in the future is exactly what's called for. Thanks very much.
Let's deal with a few of the confronting points that Aidan just made. The first point, of course, is that coal's the cheapest form of energy. Rooftop solar systems hardly ideal, and he makes the point that the honeymoon for renewables is over. Your response?
A couple of things. So the reality is we're not going to build any more coal, and you acknowledge that. You're just looking for veracity in the analysis, but it won't really change things because we will not build any more coal. And we don't need to, because if we accept that a thermal generator has a role, then the right place to turn our attention is to gas. So despite having been the chairman of the National Electricity Review, National Hydrogen Review and the Low Emissions Technology Review, I've consistently said we need gas for the final X%. The pursuit of perfection, instead of just the very good, is always going to be expensive. So I can see us getting to a 90% renewable system with solar and wind, where 10% comes from gas. But that requires a lot of investment in gas capacity. I think at the moment, Aidan, we have 12, 13 or 14 gigawatts of gas in the system. To provide that last 10%, we probably have to triple it to 25 or 30 gigawatts of gas. But each of those gas generators will only be operating a very small number of hours a year, which makes the economics extremely difficult for private operators. So that that final 10% with gas might need to be owned as a reserve by governments.
And until recently, am I right in saying that a lot of state governments, particularly the Victorian government, was quite sceptical about the prospects for gas?
Absolutely. The Victoria government has been extremely negative about gas in any form, but they've just recently, a couple of weeks ago, authorised exploration for offshore gas, which is really quite an important step in the right direction. Other states have just found it difficult to overcome the regulatory barriers. Like New South Wales has struggled to get investment in gas because their own regulations make it difficult. Part of the cost, though, that we see in our system at the moment is because of gas. Because another mistake that we've made in the past is not allocating a domestic reserve. Western Australia has, but we pay in Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland, we pay the net back price for gas. So if the exporters can get a monster of a good contract to sell liquefied natural gas to Japan, and if that contract, the landed price is $20 Australian per gigajoule, and if it costs $3 to liquefy and ship, we end up paying $17 per gigajoule here. And if you do the arithmetic, that would be electricity at $130 or $140 per megawatt hour. And the way the market works is everybody gets paid the highest price in the 5-minute clearing. So the Ukraine war pushing up the international price of gas has increased the net back price in Australia. And because we don't have a reserve, effectively we're shooting ourselves in our own feet by not having thought about that 20 or 30 years ago when we started the system.
Yeah, Aidan, notwithstanding your points about coal, the overwhelming media conventional wisdom is that renewables, wind and solar, are the cheapest form of energy. And as Alan has made in his writings, there'll be, you'd expect technological breakthroughs for battery backup for wind and solar. That might improve the transmission lines for wind and solar. Given all of that, is it fair to say then that the energy costs will come down and that power bills will come down over time?
I don't think so. I can't see any prospect of power bills in the current trajectory coming down at all. Even baked into all our forecasts and model assumptions at the moment is that all the costs for rooftop solar and grid-scale solar, they're projected to halve. If we ran at the current price out, like what we plan on building, it would be tremendously expensive. But we've assumed that they will still come down quite a lot. That's baked into the existing assumptions in the model. So I'm optimistic that, I hope they do improve. I'm not against these technologies improving and getting lower cost, but the real challenge is just how do you get that complete security and certainty of supply? And as Alan has acknowledged, you need to have quite a bit of gas. Use it very infrequently, but the capacity of it is profound. It's like having a massive engine in the car that you only put your foot down for a moment, like in the year. And I think that's expensive, and that's actually acknowledged in the integrated system plan. That there is it's going to be require some thinking about how to manage that business model to get the investment in, because we've never had to do something like that before.
Alan?
A couple of comments to elaborate. Interest rates are really hurting the renewable rollout because solar and wind is very capital intensive, as are transmission lines, but your operating costs are negligible. So the levelised cost of electricity is mostly the capital costs, and the capital costs very, very dependent on interest rates. So if interest rates go down, that will help. If social licence issues and regulatory issues can be overcome, that will help. But you still do have the need for batteries and other issues around intermittency. Two more comments. The price of batteries, because they're made in factories, is coming down dramatically quickly and faster than anybody expected.
I'm not sure, but
No, it is. It is. And what we've just seen recently is some analysis by Bloomberg on the commitments to building factories for batteries in Europe and America, and predominantly in China. They're predicting that for the rest of this decade, the manufacturing capacity will be several-fold higher than the global demand for stationary storage and vehicles combined. And that will drive prices down yet again. Batteries are outperforming expectations in a really good way.
Well, that's very interesting. Batteries are outperforming expectations. Aidan?
I'm curious about that because I've seen there was a period, I think a little period ago, when battery prices fell substantially. But we've looked in our team at the price paid for installed projects of grid-scale batteries over the last roughly 10 years. And it turns out to be more or less flat, even through the period where there was a big spike in lithium prices. So we've seen a fairly flat period in the actual paid price for most projects. And I think due to supply chain issues, etc., the ones that are being built now, we're expecting another spike again. So we're going to have probably the next ones off the line, because they have baked in costs for quite a period, will be quite significant. So I hope they come down, but I'm not holding my breath. And I would also just say the massive oversupply of potential capacity, I think that could be reflected not in a kind of long-term way, but if there has been a slowdown in the uptake from projections of electric vehicles as well. So if electric vehicles haven't been taken up as fast as projected, and they were hockey stick projections, that oversupply might not be a thing that we can rely on forever, because the glut might be worked out by the market, and the settling price, I'm just worried, might still be less far down than we want.
Okay, well now, given everything that Aidan has said and the points that you conceded before about the resistance from landowners and custodians, this is Warren Mundine, a colleague of ours at the Centre for Independent Studies. He wrote in the Financial Review not so long ago, there is a limit to how much solar and wind infrastructure traditional owners will accept on their land. You've acknowledged that. Given that, and the point I made in my introduction about the growing public backlash against rising costs as a result of government's commitments to net zero, and this has been particularly evident in Europe in the last week, is there a danger that we're putting too much emphasis on renewables? Alan?
I'm not suggesting for a second that it's not difficult, but a lot of it is planning mistakes or the wrong approach. So the developers are out there looking for the ridgetop in a national park or indigenous land that will give them the optimum generation per turbine. And then they run into resistance and their costs blow out through the roof, literally. Really, the government should be defining renewable energy zones that are much smaller than the ones that have been defined at the moment, and should be optimizes a multi-parameter optimization. So instead of just looking for the best generation capacity per turbine, they should be looking at that, the lack of indigenous objection, the lack of landholder objection, the possibility of getting transmission lines in. And those projects, in my opinion, would be economically more viable to be located in a position where they only get 2/3 of the maximum theoretical energy generated per turbine if they can pull the project off in a couple of years instead of 10 years. So there's got to be a fundamental attitudinal shift.
Well, what does this mean for targets? Because we're having this great debate right now in Canberra about emissions targets. The opposition, led by Peter Dutton, has said that we're going to miss the 2030 targets for 82% renewables. What do you make about the targets debate? Because there is a bipartisan consensus still that by 2050 we'll be net zero. Aidan?
Yeah, I think that the targets debate, the targets have been used, I think, in a way, particularly the close ones, to make it harder for nuclear, essentially, because nuclear requires it does require a very significant capital investment. But like I said, it scales beautifully in the system. So it's a slow starter, but I think it finishes very, very strong. So when you put in very near targets and say, we have to do a lot in the next 6 years, it has to be down here, it gives rise to everyone, and I've heard this a lot around the halls at the Australian Energy Week conference, it's just too late, too slow. And I just think that we have to open our minds to us finishing strong in this race. If we want to get to 2050 and want to be able to sustain what we've got to in 2050, not be dealing with costs that we would want to unwind rapidly, then you have to be able to plan a race that looks realistic. And we're at less than half the pace of the renewables rollout at the moment. And I actually think we've made great efforts, and I've heard from a number of landowners, the efforts being done to speed up and fast track the approval processes have had some side effects that are very much not welcome. I don't know how much further we can go at making that faster. Environmentally too, runoff requirements around the Great Dividing Range in Queensland for the reef, exempt for wind farms, etc. So I think we can't go that much faster, and I think the near-term targets have biased horribly against nuclear. And so I think that reassessing, if renewables look hard now, it's okay to set a target, but as you get close to it and it becomes unrealistic, you have to be able to reassess your targets as you approach them too, and figure out what now is the next best thing to do.
Alan?
Not inconsistent, but a slightly different perspective. I'm not a targets person. I ran a company for 23 years in America, and we never had a target to reach a particular percentage of the market or anything like that, but we ended up being number one in our niche market of scientific equipment by focusing on doing the best we could at any given time and producing the highest quality product. And as a result of that, we emerged as number one. So I'm not concerned personally about 82% by 2030, but I am concerned that we decarbonise our electricity system, because that is critically important for decarbonising transport and industry as quickly as we can. So I think that strategically we should be investing in renewables this decade and next decade. That doesn't mean that we should not be investing in developing nuclear for the third decade and the next 5 centuries. But when it comes to climate, it's not a brick wall. If we get to 82% in 2033 or 2034, that would also be very, very good.
Does our stance, though, in the eyes of the world look hypocritical, given that Australia still exports large quantities of coal and gas abroad? We're basically helping China and India contribute to climate change. And of course, we can't really complain because that money goes towards our budget coffers, which means we have significantly good budgets, better than expected budget surpluses. How can we reconcile that with this pledge to radically decarbonise the economy at home?
So 2 parts to the answer. First of all, we're not alone. In 2020, as Special Advisor to the Australian Government, which I was then, but I'm not now, by the way, I was asked to negotiate some bilateral industrial research agreements in the clean technology space. And we couldn't get it up with the United States because the Biden administration was fresh in the role and didn't want us to continue our policies of exporting coal and natural gas. 2 years later, the Biden administration has now become in 2023, has become the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and they're authorising more and more exploration that they said they would never do because practical realities hit home.
But doesn't this all show that...
Second part of the answer is if we decided to stop exporting coal to India, for example, it's not likely that Prime Minister Modi would call up Prime Minister Albanese and say, Tony, thank you for bringing it to our attention that we should not be burning all that coal. There might be an expletive in the discussion, which would then be followed, and we're just going to go and buy it from Russia or South Africa or Brazil or somewhere else. So if you look at the planetary benefits, us not exporting natural gas or coal doesn't buy any reduction.
But the reality is that global net emissions are skyrocketing still, and it's largely because of the non-OECD. You mentioned China and India there. Those leaders want to grow their economies and reduce poverty, and the cheapest way of doing that for the foreseeable future is surely on the back of carbon energy, Alan.
But they recognise their role to be responsible. So China gets criticised all the time. But if you look at just last year and look at the global deployment of solar power, more than 60% was in China. More than half of the global. Same for wind, same for nuclear, same for hydroelectricity. It changes from year to year. China is leading the world, investing in all four of the large scalable zero emissions technologies. Now, as a result of that, their share of electricity from coal has fallen from 80% to 60% since 2005, which is very impressive. But their emissions have gone up because their total energy demand has gone up. Why? Because they're, what you said, they're bringing people out of poverty, but they're also the industrial powerhouse. You look at a lot of the Western countries, or if I'm allowed to say that, the OECD countries, some of their success in decarbonising their economy has been by deindustrialisation to India and China and Thailand and other places. So you've got to take a global perspective.
So China is a climate change trendsetter in greening the planet. Aidan Morrison.
I think that we give far too much credit to China, and let me explain why. I think that China is this stage where they are expanding their industrial base. They're massive industrial supplier and refiner of metals and things like that. So they are leading the world in these productive capacities, which means their demand for energy is skyrocketing, and which means that they get to replay the honeymoon part of renewables over and over again. So they keep installing massive amounts of solar and wind that makes progressives in California and Australia absolutely swoon. It's just so much more solar and wind than we could ever poke a stick at. But at the same time, they're still growing their base electricity needs, and I don't see them moving outside and really getting beyond that first easy 15 to 20% anytime soon. They're just growing their energy needs so much.
Let me, we'll get to questions very soon, but let me just raise the nuclear issue. Now, Alan, in the Financial Review about a year ago, less than a year ago, you said, from a purely engineering perspective, there is no better source of zero emissions electricity than nuclear power. Its synchronous generators possess useful characteristics called inertia and strength. It can dispatch electricity when requested and inherently understand the 50 cycles per second heartbeat of our electricity system. You went on to say that in principle, nuclear power plants can be located close to existing transmission lines. But you're not bullish about nuclear energy in the next 20 years. Why?
Because it takes time. So there's, as I said, there's two types, small modular reactors, they're not ready. So you can't even think about that. So you have to take an existing design and then start the industry from scratch. The best example of that is the United Arab Emirates. And they can do things pretty fast. In 2008, they decided to go from no nuclear regulation system, no nuclear generation, to a very big 4-reactor nuclear plant at a place called Barakah, 5.6 gigawatts. That's like 4 or 5 large coal-fired power stations. It's huge. They were clever. They sought a experienced company, KEPCO, the South Korean company, to do it. They signed the contract within a year, by 2009. And yet the first electrons from the first of the 4 reactors didn't flow until 2021. That took 13 years.
Wow.
They can approve a site much more quickly than we can. They don't ask people, they just say it'll be there. They can build a transmission line to connect it to a population centre much more quickly than we can. they don't have to spend 3 or 4 years working out where they're going to raise 30 or 40 billion US dollars. They just withdraw it from the piggy bank. It's a lot easier to do things in the UAE, and it even took them 13 years.
Right.
So I think it would be generous to think we could do it in 15. Maybe we could do it between 15 and 20 years. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Because
Long
we've got
term.
the centuries to worry about.
Now, following on from Alan, Aidan, it is true that 18 of the 22 countries which signed the COP28 declaration, this was last year in the Middle East, to triple nuclear energy use globally by 2028. That was their commitment. So you had 18 of those 22 countries. Now, they have had long-established nuclear energy industries. Now, Senator Penny Wong says that these nations, many decades ago, made a decision to go down the nuclear path. Australia made a case not to do that. That's Penny Wong's response to you. How would you respond to Penny Wong?
It's never a better time to start than right now. There's just no reason to delay starting this. It will be slow. Slow to get started. I think that the UAE is given the West a masterclass in how to build nuclear. The US, the UK have made the very worst mistakes in the book. They've started with a brand new design, or at least a brand new consortium that's never built this type of reactor before. And they've just built like one or maybe two. And like this is the absolute guarantee in my mind that you will have expensive nuclear. The Arabs did the opposite, and it still takes at least 10 years to get started, but they said we're going to commit to a mature design, find the company that knows their design inside out, and we're going to order at least 4 and size our site for 6, by the way. That's the way to build nuclear. And sure, it takes a while to get started, but once they had their first one connected, the next one connected a year later. That's another 1.5. It's 2 coal power units the next year. The next year, another one. The next year, another one. That's the way to build nuclear. It finishes very strong after the slow start.
Yeah, but it's not just a question of timing with nuclear industry. It's also where you're going to put these reactors. Now, Chris Bowen, the Energy Minister, past guest at CIS on several occasions, he makes this point about small modular reactors. He says they'll cost $5 billion, which according to Bowen is a lot of billions for not many megawatts. Aidan?
I've never advocated for small modular reactors. That's the sad fact. I think that they were a thought bubble that occurred out of the tech bros Silicon Valley culture, and I just think that everything about power systems engineering says there's massive economies of scale. The small is beautiful thing was a hand-wavy idea that someone just took long to throw away, in my opinion. That's,
And I would just add that, look, they might eventuate, but they're not here and now.
Okay.
And no one should be costing a small modular reactor because there is no input assumption that you can use to predict what the cost would be.
And so you made the point about Russia and China as well, right?
Yeah. You can't base our costs on what they've done.
Yes. Okay, now it's time for question time, Q&A. First question over here. Just wait for the mic, mate.
Brad Hogan, welcome, by the way, to CIS to Melbourne, and thank you to the speakers for tonight. I'd like to quote the IEA, the International Energy Association, who have said that transition to renewables is not possible without nuclear. They've also come out and said that renewables are the cheapest form of energy. I think tonight what we've been asked for is to look at two disparate arguments where, in fact, I think there is some middle ground. And in terms of our priorities, what we should be looking at is energy security, our decarbonisation targets, and certainly economy and the impacts that renewables and other forms, including nuclear, will have on our economy. I think that the challenge for you, Aidan, with your thesis is you're going to have to come up with some hard numbers in terms of what is the cost, the levelised cost of energy from nuclear in our CSIRO, and I know you've written to AEMO with quite an extensive set of complaints with their modelling, but they list the levelised cost of electricity is between $400 and $600 a megawatt hour, and they claim renewables are between $120 to $180 per megawatt hour. That needs to be sorted because without that, there is no value proposition. And the consequences for the Australian population are significant. The other thing I'd like to take issue...
Quickly, yep.
One more is the transmission costs. And to me, I think the connecting energy islands is a valuable investment. I think it's something similar to what the National Broadband Network. It affects and improves the quality of lives for all Australians as we become more electric dependent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Aidan, your response to that? These kind of questions are the kind of questions that Peter Dutton will be receiving a lot in the lead up to the next election.
I get lots and lots of requests for firm numbers on nuclear, and I would just like to see the firm numbers on renewables first, because I actually think that at some point we won't be worried about whether it costs $110 or $150 per megawatt hour for nuclear. And by the way, the CSIRO have produced numbers that started around a little over 150 and go a bit above that for their large-scale nuclear. And I think when you adjust for capacity factors, it's back in the band. It's around about 130, 140. So I think that we are not far away there on having a credible number for nuclear. But yeah, my overall emphasis is that we have very little transparency on the CSIRO integrated cost of renewables. And in my mind, AEMO, the market operator, who have done the very, very detailed modelling, they should just add up the whole bill. They should just tell us, if they've gone to that much detail to model the whole energy system, they should tell us what it will cost relative to what we have now and relative to what if we didn't try to decarbonise. That's a calculable thing. It's possible to produce. My question is, why haven't they produced that hard number?
Okay, next question.
Hi, Tyrone Dalal from We Planet Australia. The EU taxonomy sets out an embodied emissions target of less than 100 grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Should Australia abandon our renewable energy target and instead have an embodied emissions target so that we can bring down the overall emissions of our energy system rather than just going on a technology focus? Because there's new research coming out that a lot of the panels being built in China using coal-fired power stations have very high embodied emissions. So this is something that maybe we should consider.
Alan.
Looking at the emissions intensity, embodied emissions intensity, is a perfectly valid thing to do, but everybody's chosen to look at the renewables percentage, and they both track in the same direction. I think what you're proposing is more fundamentally important, but it's much easier for people to see the renewables as a percentage. So it won't change, and there wouldn't be enough benefit to take that perspective. But in terms of your second point on the embodied energy in the panels, I used to get that because I was one of the first people in the country to have an electric car, and people would say, oh, you live in Melbourne and you'll plug in and you'll get electricity from the brown coal generators in your lawn, and therefore it's worse than driving a petrol car. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but if you looked at the Australian grid average, I was doing better than a comparable petrol car. But you've got to look at the future, and the embodied emissions per kilowatt in a solar panel has been coming down very, very fast, even when they're using coal-fired electricity, but the manufacturing processes are getting better and better and better. Plus, they're reducing the percentage of coal-fired electricity across the country in any event. So eventually the embodied emissions will migrate towards zero. I just don't worry about it at the moment because it's moving in the right direction. And if we don't buy the solar panels today because of that high embodied emissions, then they'll never get the embodied emissions down. So we have to move forward.
Okay, Aidan, and then we'll go to the next question.
I think it's really reasonable to say that we should just have the targets on technology neutral aspects like the total life cycle embodied and scope 1 and the produced emissions. And I think it's strange that we've chosen in Australia to use just renewable energy. It just is basically a technological preference that's baked in. It's an ideological preference to say this is the way we want to do it, but we should just say we require very, very low carbon, and I think that would serve the case for nuclear extremely well. So I think that's definitely the way to go. And I just want to pick up on that point that Alan made. I do think we need to still keep a close eye on the embodied emissions, because in the case of China, I think that for a while at least, the consensus was that the increase of new coal-fired particular, there was, for a lot of plants, the average went up at a point, and so there's been, I think, very credible numbers that put it around 68 to 90 grams of carbon. And that's assuming a big industrial one with good access tracking, that sort of thing. So you can easily get above 100 grams per kilowatt hour for solar on rooftops in Australia. And I just think that's a lot lower than coal, which is 1,000, miles lower. But nuclear is at like 6, 9, something like that. So, I mean, once you've got nuclear in the system, solar displacing nuclear is not doing anything.
I think I've got to respond. I think it's a pointless argument. If you look at the embodied carbon emissions in wind-fired electricity, it's about the same as nuclear.
It's close, yeah.
It's about 15 or 20.
Yeah, sure.
15 or 20, whereas solar is 45 or 50.
Yeah.
But if you went back and looked at the solar panels being built 20 years ago, I don't know what it was probably 200, 300, 500 or more. By investing in solar, we've helped the manufacturers do a better job. So let's just go for it. You can find the emissions intensity of any country's electricity system. There are plenty of websites that tell you that France is about 90 grams per kilowatt hour. We're about 500 or 600 grams per kilowatt hour. It's where it's tracking, and we do need to be below 100 grams per kilowatt hour ultimately to have an impact on reducing carbon dioxide emissions. But don't overplay it at the moment.
The sceptics will come back to you, Alan, and they'd say, if renewables are so cheap, why does it require an ever-growing taxpayer subsidy?
Well, they're not subsidising as much as they were, but they are providing incentives, so that's the kind of subsidy. I think one of the important things about the costings is that you can't just look at a levelised cost of electricity for solar in isolation of the percentage of solar and wind in the system.
Of course.
So today we've got 32% solar and wind, and people come up with the cost of electricity. But if we had 70% solar and wind in the system, it would be substantially more expensive to put in the next kilowatt of solar, because you need more transmission lines, you need more batteries. That's the honeymoon, the low penetration is the honeymoon that you're talking about.
We agree, yeah.
Okay, next question. Yes, sir. No, I think we've got a mic at the back. Sorry, mate. Yep.
Oh, yeah, hi. Thanks. Our Energy Minister uses GenCost to argue that his aversion to nuclear is not ideological. He claims it's economic. Yet in their system, they still have up to 21%, I think, offshore wind, which is, if there's anything more expensive, horrifically expensive and slow, and starting from a base where we don't have an existing industry. Just like a comment on where you see the position of offshore wind in the system, and whether or not that would be a portion that nuclear could substitute, and you could not run an economic argument against it.
I'll start if you like.
Sure.
Up until a couple of years ago, offshore wind was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and looking quite good. The combination of interest rates and supply chain costs have dramatically increased the per megawatt hour cost of electricity from offshore wind. It's now very expensive, or projected to be very expensive, and it's in the band that Aidan mentioned before. The high figure for nuclear that was quoted from the audience was probably the small modular reactors. The latest GenCost report on large scale gives you two figures. I think it was $143 a megawatt hour and $280 or $290 a megawatt hour, depending on whether it's running hard at almost 90% of its capacity or running slow at, say, just over 50% of its capacity. But offshore wind is right up there with the low end of that nuclear range, and it could get worse because of infrastructure, construction costs.
Very quickly, Aidan.
I can't see any economic justification for going to offshore wind, which costs close to nuclear, approaching, before you've added in the requirement to still firm it and still provide the backup. So I think that offshore wind, I can't see why it's included. And take note, nothing in the integrated system plan would include offshore wind in our optimised model they produce. It's only in the integrated system plan because the Victorian government has mandated a specific target. So the ISP simply puts it in and says we have to have it there, and they don't add up the cost and say that it costs more for Victoria to have done that. And I think that's an opportunity to improve.
We are fast running out of time. We've got time for just two quick questions. Make them short. Yes, sir.
A couple of things. I agree with you about transmission.
Most of it would be far better replaced. Sorry?
Most of it would be far better replaced with storage as transmission, and as Alan says, dynamic rating and reconductoring and all that. If we build nuclear, we will have to replace the transmission, by the way, because none of it is rated for the storm ratings that is necessary for nuclear power. Because if a nuclear power plant trips off, it goes off for 72 hours to 2 weeks. And so you have to have much more robust transmission. But I am very curious about all these developments in nuclear power that we keep reading about, when nuclear power generated last year around the world was less than in 2006. And it's going nowhere. In the last 5 years, 40 reactors have closed and 30 have opened. It's just a hoax.
A hoax. Aidan.
I think it's
And
the
then we'll go
saddest
to-
thing. I think it's the saddest thing in the world that the world stopped building nuclear power. But I think that's absolutely, the fact that we paused for a while and we're now starting to re-emerge and look at it again is absolutely no reason to still acknowledge what it is. It's a miraculous technology. It's basically like, it's just human brain power condensed to make energy just pop out of a building with negligible material requirements. And so I just think that we should recognise the value it has and return to that technology. And it's absolutely available to us at the moment to embrace. So the world pausing it, it's been described as a victim of infanticide. Nuclear is still a young technology that was a victim of infanticide, and we should rescue it and nurture it. It's got a lot of growing to do yet, but we start with the designs we know, the large-scale reactors, and we should build a lot of them.
Alan Finkel.
Just a couple of very quick things. You're right, the percentage share of nuclear in global electricity production has pretty much halved. The absolute quantity has stayed flat, slightly gone off. In America, which is at this moment the world's largest producer of nuclear-powered electricity, they just finished one earlier, or switched one on earlier this year. There are none in construction, so there won't be any more for at least 10 years. It's quite extraordinary. And finally, on the transmission lines, you're right, but you can do a hybrid nuclear where you have some significant battery capacity at the location of the nuclear station that will get you over those sorts of problems.
Okay, final question, just quickly, yep.
I'm Barry Battis from Savannah, Central Victoria, and there's a group of farmers here tonight with me. And I just wanted to know that I think both speakers briefly touched on the impact of on the First Nations people and also on landholders. Now, I think people need to remember that that this transmission project and power source that we're talking about here does impact very heavily on agriculture. And without agricultural people admitting or agreeing to this project will not happen. And we are a massive player in this project. And I'm wondering now, the world in the last 50 years, we've had to increase our production by 30% food in the world. And they're predicting that we'll have to, the next 50 years, increase our food production by another 30%. Now, we're going to cover our land with all this, what we are hearing tonight, ridiculous generation of power. How are we going to produce the food for the world? How is it going to happen if we're going to produce, as the Minister says, we're going to cover the world, Victoria, by 55%. That's if we do offshore wind turbines. And that's probably not going to happen, as you both speakers said tonight. Yeah. How in the heck are we going to produce the food to cover the world and to feed the nation? This project has not got social licence. It's clearly no social licence. It's been forced through at a massive rate of knots, potentially, without any thought process and any indication of what the people in the country have got to say, no thought at all.
Okay, so this brewing farmers' backlash, we're seeing this quite evident in Europe right now. Alan, your response to the question?
The world's food output has increased, but the amount of acreage or hectareage in farming has been it's like peak hectares. It's started to go down again because the productivity per hectare has gone up. So that's a balancing factor. I'm not saying you're wrong in what you've mentioned, but the productivity consistently goes up in yields of grain and oil and other things per hectare. Plus, to some extent, agriculture and, say, wind turbine electricity production can coexist, Depends on the kind of agriculture.
We are out of time. On behalf of CIS, can you please thank our guests, Alan and Aidan. Great work, guys. Fantastic. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.